protective as the environment as California's. Now, in listening to Mr. Younger's testimony, one would think that, what's the problem? It sounded like a very rigorous process. The question, though, is, as Mr. Wan testified, they submitted a report to the CPUC in June of last year, which analyzed the BC project. Now, in that report, it said things like, and I'm quoting, BC run-of-river hydro facilities would not be qualified as RPS-eligible resources in California. It says BC run-of-river hydro facilities would not meet any of these criteria, meaning California's regulations. It also says the key obstacle to project success, which means importing BC hydro to California for RPS eligibility, is that must be modified by legislation is the definition of new small hydro generation. So there's a very strong contradiction here, I think, between the testimony that is being given and the picture that is being painted that BC's laws are no problem, that they're going to protect the environment, yet PG&E's proposed amendments are to basically weaken California's regulations. Now, the way they are proposing to weaken the regulations is what's required now is that out-of-state hydro must meet California regulations. What PG&E is proposing, as I think Mr. Wan would agree, is that instead of California regulations be used, that the regulations of the locality where the hydro is produced out of state be used instead. In other words, BC's laws. The other thing that they are proposing is to increase the size criteria for out-of-state hydro from the current 30, that is obviously California's, to 50. So there is a disconnect between what is being presented and what the actuality is. I'm going to make some. Okay, and then in PG&E's report to the CPUC, when we saw this report and we picked out these things, we thought, my God, why are they sending this information when they're admitting that the BC projects would not meet California regulations? Here is what they've said as a rationale for why they are proposing it. It may be argued that a different stream flow requirement and an increase in the maximum capacity limit, meaning increasing from 30 to 50, may be warranted due to different circumstances in British Columbia. Now, we found this statement to be astounding because there are, in fact, very different conditions in British Columbia. As everyone here knows, the situation on California rivers is that our rivers are highly compromised, largely due to hydro. Now, we're not making a judgment call about PG&E's hydro. Obviously, hydro is a very important part of California's energy portfolio, but the consequences of those hydro facilities are very impaired rivers. Every one of our rivers is impaired except for the Smith River up north. And the result of that is reduced flows and, of course, the salmonid crisis and other native fish species crisis that we're experiencing. So on to specific things. PG&E has also touted a letter from Mr. Younger's boss, Bruce Penner, who has claimed that information provided to the legislature by our organization and others is inaccurate. He especially took exception to something that I testified to when I said that PG&E's projects would dewater rivers. In his letter to the legislature, he said a project is not permitted to dewater the river in British Columbia. I think Mr. Younger is familiar with the East Montrose project, in which the project proponent was wanting to divert 95% of the stream flow. Now, in the Environmental Assessment Office assessment, it responded back to the proponent, which is Plutonic Power Corporation, and it said, the Ministry of Environment is concerned that the proponent is proposing in-stream flow releases that are substantially lower than the minimum flows recommended in the BC in-stream flow guidelines. Plutonic Power responded back to the ministry that their project was not economically viable unless they were able to divert the 95% of the water. The Environmental Assessment Office then ignored its own guidelines and approved the 95% diversion. Now, we are told by credible sources in British Columbia that this is common. 85 to 95% of stream flow is diverted. Now, to give you a picture of what a project looks like, the term run-of-river is being used very loosely because it implies something that's benign. But as a PG&E hydro person explained to me, what a run-of-river project actually is high up in a watershed you have a dam where there is an impoundment of water. You have a pipe, which is called the penstock, which diverts the water off the stream to a powerhouse, which then generates the electricity. The distance between the diversion, the dam, and the powerhouse can be miles. And that stretch of river in between those two is the part of the river where the water is being taken out. Now, Mr. Penner may be right that, 95% is not dewatering a river if you define dewatering as bone dry. But I think everybody else would consider 85 to 95% to be significant dewatering. Another exception to Mr. Penner's letter was received and sent to the legislature by Jim Abram, who is a BC local elected official, former president of the Union of BC Municipalities, which represents 184 local governments in BC. Mr. Abrams said, "I would like to draw your attention to the misleading, incorrect, and deceptive comments that you have received from the Minister of Environment for BC." He also says, Mr. Penner, mentions that local governments are consulted in the consideration of run-of-river projects. This is absolutely wrong. We have had our regulatory powers stripped from us. He goes on to say, the BC provincial government, quote, took away the power of local governments to enact land use regulations with regard to run-of-river projects when they passed Bill 30 in 2003. Land use planning is part of our mandate. In this particular use, we have had the mandate removed in a bill, effectively hidden in another bill regarding utilities. He also says, there's another bill. I was there at the implementation of Bill 30. It is aimed at eliminating community input into the development of our resources. It follows on the heels of Bill 38, and I've attached analyses of that bill as well. That greatly weakened BC environmental laws, which eliminated the environmental review process for any project under 50 megawatts. Now, Mr. Younger has said that they have the ability to require or to compel projects to undergo that. But basically, one of the things that Bill 38 did was it made projects under 50 megawatts, the environmental review process, voluntary. And we all know what voluntary means. And so I go on to quote, effectively allowing projects that had the potential to be dangerous to our environment to be pushed through on a fast-track basis for the profits to a few with the impacts to many. Now, the other thing that is, very convenient is PG&E proposing that the size criteria be increased from 30 to 50 megawatts. Well, obviously, it's because of this change in the bill. There's also other evidence.
Mr. Nakatan, I'm sorry, before you move on to the expansion of the size, I just want to give a heads up with my most profound apologies to the members of the third panel that we are in fact being called down to session like right about now, and so we're going to have to postpone the third panel to another date. I'm terribly sorry about that, but I wanted to let you know that. But I do want to let Mr. Nakatani finish. And my apologies and thanks to the members of the third panel. Sorry about that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's also additional recent information from the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation that says, quote, inspection reports and emails obtained by CBC News show that BC government officials have raised concerns about environmental infractions during the construction of the rapidly growing number of run-of-river private power projects in the province. This includes sloppy construction that could damage streams and overcutting old-growth forests. There's some other things, too, I didn't want to put in the laundry list. The Vancouver Sun also has a similar article that says that some independent power producers are ignoring environmental regulations aimed at protecting old-growth forests, wildlife, streamside habitat, leaked BC government documents suggest. Now, there's a clear difference in opinion between the evidence that I'm providing and what Mr. Younger is saying about the rigorous environmental review processes. Now, in the larger perspective, what's happening in BC is that BC privatized their power development several years ago. I'm not sure what's behind it, but, developing project, of course, is big money. And now what's happening is that there has been a wholesale submission of permits for projects, run-of-river projects. Virtually every river in BC has a permit for a run-of-river project. Now, not all of those will be developed, I'll grant you, but there is no type of overall process to determine what is the best type of projects to move forward with. It's just wholesale try to get things approved. So we submit very strongly that it is not true that there will not be significant impacts in BC from development. Far from it. It's the opposite. There will be tremendous impacts. BC rivers are in a pristine condition, not like California's. So any type of development is going to have significant impacts. One other thing. We're also hearing, and this doesn't, I don't think, relates to PG&E. One of their people told me that they're not behind this, but we also hear that there is a proposal to increase the size criteria for existing hydro projects. So I don't think this is talking about the BC projects. I believe that this is for in-state. To increase the size criteria from 30 to 50 megawatts. Now, we don't like this for the same reason we don't like the 30 megawatt criteria, because size is not an indicator of environmental impact. There are some much larger projects that are well operated that have much less environmental impact than so-called small projects. One very good example is the Klamath project. We all know the impacts of that project. That is an RPS eligible project. That has huge impacts. Now, we have been very reasonable. I mean, we're reasonable overall. I think Mr. Wan knows, and he testified that they are looking to increase the efficiency from existing generation through Mr. Blakesley's bill, AB 809, 2 years ago. We worked very closely with PG&E and Mr. Blakesley to get that approved. We thought that was a good idea. Squeeze more energy out of the existing operations as long as there is no increased environmental damage. So if there is a reasonable proposal put forward, we're willing to work with folks on it, but we'll stand the ground on things that we think are totally unreasonable. On the one last thing, on the potentially reasonable side, we went to PG&E and said, look, we're willing to talk to you about removing the size criteria altogether if those large projects over 30 megawatts and are then environmentally certified. Now, we don't know if that's a good idea or not. We're willing to explore it. We think a feasibility study needs to be done to assess whether that's good or not. Surprisingly, the PG Hydro folks were very skeptical about that. They thought that, projects that have recently gone through FERC relicensing had got as much environmental benefit as possible. We strongly disagree. We think that there is opportunity to get additional environmental impact if it's cost effective and you guys get RPS eligibility for large project. I think it meets both needs, both increased RPS eligibility and improved environmental benefits. Now, there could be a downside, and I think that's what the feasibility study is needed for, and that is if a number of these large projects are then RPS eligible, what does it do to the RPS program? Does it discourage the development of new renewables, which, of course, RPS is about? So we think that's a downside.
I know there's some questions, Mr. Berryhill.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Nakatani, for coming up here today, and sorry that we're going to have to cut this a little bit short. I'm going to give you just a kind of a what if here, and then a question behind that. But if we were to bless all the eligible renewable resources from BC, and given that this bi-directional transmission line was built, my question to you is, what would you like to see, and what would give you a little bit of comfort, I guess, that this small run-of-river hydro that we're talking about here would not harm the environment of BC?
I think that's a good question. I think the answer is very simple. Use California regulations. Why are our regulations good enough for us but not good enough for use outside of the state? It doesn't make sense. Another perspective is Mr. Krikorian, as you started out saying, California is the world's leader. California is also the nation's leader in environmental protection. I don't think we want to jeopardize our reputation by importing energy and exporting environmental impacts. That's not good for the state.
Well, thank you. You know, we've tried to get a bipartisan fix on this thing, and Mr. Krikorian has worked so hard for this whole thing. We're trying, both sides are trying to come to consensus so we can make this a win-win, but I am interested. Would you support expansion of the limit to 50 megawatts here in California if we move this thing forward?
No, like I said, we're not happy with the 30 megawatt because size. First of all, small hydro, 30 megawatts or 50 megawatts is not small hydro. The Klamath dams are RPS eligible. They're under 30 megawatts. They have huge impacts. There's going to be more impacts from 50 megawatt projects that are similarly poorly operated. So size is the wrong measuring stick to use. I think environmental impact is the right measuring stick, and we need to figure that out.
Yeah, and if I can, I don't mean to interrupt, Mr. Berryhill, but I want to focus on that point for a minute, because if we were to try to come up with an eligibility definition that was not based on output, but rather impacts, how would you define that? What would be the impacts that you think would have to be included in that? Are there existing legal regimens that we could borrow upon, and how would you see certification being done if we're talking about a facility that's outside of the state?
Right. Excellent question. The good news is that there is an organization based in Maine. It's a nonprofit. It's called Low Impact Hydro Institute, which has a set of criteria, and there's now a voluntary program of which some utilities take advantage of. In fact, PGE, Portland General Electric, has some of their projects that are certified by LEHI is the acronym. Now, so they have like an 8-point thing. It's like fish passage and water quality and riparian vegetation and those sorts of things. Now, I realize that California is not going to give up authorization authority to a nonprofit, but I mention these criteria because they exist. They're not perfect, but we're pretty okay with them. They're in the process of being reviewed, and I think that they can be used as a starting point for California to develop its own. And I would imagine that the CEC would be the entity that would lead this process.
Mr. Smythe.
Thank you. Just real quick, I mean, obviously, we're not as familiar with BC regulations and California's, and so hearing kind of conflicting testimony. So I don't know if you could just kind of cliff note it for me. I mean, what is it the environmental enforcement? Why is it insufficient in BC? I mean, what? Like I said, I mean, I know we're up against the clock, so I don't mean to put you.
No, that's fine. It's a very simple answer, and that is why is PG&E proposing BC regulations instead of California's? Why are California's regulations good enough for us, but not for imported energy? It doesn't make sense.
Well, if you don't mind, Mr. Smythe, why don't we hear from PG&E and in response to that?
We come from and in addition to the response, if you could just speak to the point about this, is it LEHI criterion?
Yeah, Low Impact Hydro Institute.
Yeah, just, I mean, if that's been looked at all, as you respond.
I'll respond to that one first. I'm not familiar with them, since I don't oversee our hydro operation. But I can tell you from our perspective that you really need to look at the climate and the topography of each environment. And what I'm talking about is that let's really think about the temperature of the water, what kind of fish, what kind of wildlife, what kind of habitat. Are we really going to apply our standards to everywhere else in the world? Because our river system and our habitat are not the same as everywhere else. I mean, there's got to be some places, and whether it's inside this country or outside, where we do trust the local jurisdiction. We can't apply our standards to everywhere in the world, is my perspective.
Can I respond to that? I totally agree with you that you have to look at the situations on the ground, and like I said, BC's rivers are in much better shape than California. Better shape meaning that they have not been developed to the extent that ours have. As we all know here, California's rivers are hammered, totally hammered. We produce hydro, that's great, but there's been huge impacts. And so when you move development to a context in which there has been no development, there's going to be significant impacts. And I think I'd like to ask, it's probably breaking protocol, but I think talking about
We're way past that point.
Okay, Bill 38 in Canada, in BC, I think needs to be talked about a bit more. And basically, my understanding of Bill 38 is that it really weakened British Columbia's environmental laws. And Bill 30 removed the authority of locals to make project determinations. Mr. Wan just said about, why should California impose its regulations on places outside of the state? Well, that's what BC is doing to the locals. Mr. Younger is well familiar with the Ashlew project, which local authorities voted against 8-1 because of the impacts. And because of the provisions in Bill 30, the BC Provincial Council overruled the locals and approved the project. The project is now under construction. The same with the Montrose project, the East Montrose project that I cited. 95% river diversion, despite that long list of environmental assessments that they go through. Diverting 95% of a river, that's a huge impact.
So can I offer a comment?
Sure.
Thank you. I just don't want to sit here and let it go unnoticed that I would very much disagree with many of the assertions that Mr. Nakatani is stating, and I don't intend to get into a debate, but I do want to sort of put that on the record for you. I think there's a number of documents that are referenced on the last slide of my presentation. A lot of them have tremendous detail about the processes that one goes through in British Columbia. We have an interest in a strong environmental regulatory framework for our own interests, not simply to try and make that case in other jurisdictions. The people of British Columbia are keenly watching our process, and I hear from people who say it takes too long, costs too much money, and others who say, that one should have never got through. That's the nature of the business, and we manage these projects. But what I do want to also add on the context of all of this is things do differ. For example, the decision about how much water can be diverted from a creek will depend on where in the creek it is. And if it's upstream of a waterfall and there's no fish, then there's a higher percentage that can be diverted, as opposed to if it's below a fish barrier and there may be fish in there. And there's all sorts of compensation plans that the Department of Fisheries and Oceans requires if there's an impact. So, we spend a lot of time and energy and a lot of public servants working on these things. I just don't want it to be suggested otherwise.
Let me ask an intentionally provocative question, because it just helps me think when I do that sometimes. If our goals for our RPS policy are protecting local air quality, reducing our contribution to global warming, having a more reliable fuel supply, and more stable pricing, as well as creating local jobs, why should it be our concern as legislators about whether or not the hydro approval process in British Columbia differs from that in California? If we're getting directly delivered clean power from hydro facilities, isn't it up to the people and legislators of British Columbia to decide what protections their rivers should get?
Not according to our current legislation or regulations, which says that any imported energy must meet our regulations, and we hold ourselves to high standards, and I think we should do the same for out-of-state. But to get to the other parts of your question, I think we need to look at this in the broader context of global warming. Yeah, of course, it's probably the most significant problem that mankind has faced in its history. Yes, we need to do a hell of a lot and then some to even attempt to get a handle on it. And that's the justification that people are using to basically develop everything in sight to try to stem the tide, if you will, of global warming. Now, that speaks to a principle or a process or an ethic of, well, we got to destroy some parts of the environment in order to save it. That doesn't make sense. You know, what we should be doing is having a strategic way forward to develop renewable energy, not this willy-nilly develop everything in sight sort of thing. And I know the challenges that are involved in that. But, I mean, you had a meeting last September, I believe, when you invited the Enviros to talk about this. And I spoke to the need to develop such a strategy. Now, of all the different types of renewable energies that we have, there are some that are less, they all have impacts, but some have less impacts than others. And I think we need to figure out, like you had testimony before about 500 megawatt solar projects, and there are wind projects, and sure, they're not, they're not firm power, but they are really clean sources, and they are, arguably, they have much less impacts than hydro. Now, there are studies that show that of energy types, including nuclear and coal, hydro has amongst the most impacts, because in temperate climates, rivers are the most important ecosystems. And so I think we really need to have a strategy of how to move forward and not just develop everything.
Anything else? This is just one point. Mr. Nakatani talked about the impacts of the BC hydro systems on the salmon crisis that we face in the Pacific Northwest. And could you talk about?
Excuse me. I'm speaking to fish in general. I mean, salmons, yes, but fish generally.
And I just wanted to give you an opportunity to respond to that,
Sure,
Mr.
thank
Younger.
you. The majority of the projects that involve run-of-river generation are located, the intake and the tail race, the return of the water, is above fish-bearing portions of the stream. So if there's, say, a waterfall that fish can't jump up, and if a project is located completely above that, a certain percentage of the water is diverted, piped down through the powerhouse, back into the creek, returns to the waterfall, down it goes. There's still some in-stream flow requirements as appropriate, but that's one of the most significant ways in which potential adverse impacts to fish or fish habitat are avoided. In those cases, like the example that I gave you, the certificate that I gave you, where there's at least some indication, very minimal, but some indication that fish are in those waters, then there's other provisions that apply. For example, under the Federal Fisheries Act, fisheries officials will assess whether a proposed project has the potential to call what we refer to as a HAD, a hazardous alteration, disruption, or destruction of fish habitat. If they feel it will not, they'll say so by letter. If they feel it would, it's a much more complex process. You may or may not get that, and if you do get it, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans would typically require compensation for habitat loss. I believe it's generally 2 to 1. So those are a couple ways in which those matters are addressed.
Okay, Mr. Nakatani, one final comment, and then since I've lost most of the audience, all of the members, and I'm about to lose my relationship with the speaker if I don't get to the floor. One brief comment.
Right, 30 seconds. So I know that PG&E and BC also say what Mr. Younger just said about, they're proposing projects above fish barriers and things like that. Well, anecdotal evidence indicates that, because some people have gone out to these places where supposedly there aren't fish, and of course they find fish up there. And it's not just fish, it's habitat. Imagine a river as an artery, and you take 95% of the blood out of the artery. What's that going to do to the entire system? That's what happens to a river. It's not just fish. It's a huge impact.
Okay, thank you very much. Now I'm going to thank the panelists very much for their participation, and especially Mr. Younger for the long distance that you traveled to come. Thank you very much for being here. Is there anyone who would wish to offer public comment? Thank you all very, very much. This has been a very informative hearing, and we are adjourned.